they have this inbuilt knowledge of like 1,000 different microservices that have really fucking weird names.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, I need to add two numbers together. Don't worry. There's a plugin for that. And then it's like called Weed Whacker or something.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 414 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the tools developer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artist.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is May 5th, 20 Jubilee.
May the 5th be with you, as it
That's
goes.
what they say. There will be profanity on this show, so be ready for that. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you very much for helping us keep our mic tubes full of mic juice. All right, you guys.
Gross. Is that like a trombone? You know, like a trombone fills up with juice?
Yeah, you got to empty it out. You know.
That was
Well,
my
I guess in this,
Like, I didn't like band very much, but easily the worst part of the entire like band experience was emptying the spit valve.
Yep. No one tells you about that.
Oh my God, horrible, disgusting.
That's like
and you just did it. You just like did it on the floor. Like,
Actually, yeah, where did we do that?
You
we
just
just
spray
did
it on
it
the floor.
Did we
on
literally
the
just put it on
ground.
the floor? Yeah, I have no recollection of that
yeah,
part.
you just had like all these, adolescents just dumping
Just
an hour's
spit on the
worth of
floor.
their saliva onto the ground.
Oh, it's even worse now that I remember. Oh my God.
It was horrible.
Play the guitar. You know, that's what you should do.
Yeah, anything you don't have to spit into is a
that's
good
better.
instrument. All right, so let's talk about something kind of whack that happened over this past week and a half. We're gonna go on a journey. I'm gonna tell a little long story with lots of parts. Okay,
And we got
3-act play.
You're gonna figure out how to stay like at the right weed level so that everybody can peer out over the tall grass, you know?
Yeah. All right. So here's what happened. A couple weeks ago, I went into the dentist. Actually, it was two Mondays ago. I went into the dentist to get my gums stabbed with a scalpel. Mm-hmm. I had a gum transplant a while ago. I had too much leftover gums.
You did too good.
I did too good on my healing, and they were like, "Get these fucking gums off of here. You got too much gums now." Mm-hmm. So they literally took some of my gums off. Okay. So that was how my Monday kind of ended at the end of the workday. Just went over, got my gum stabbed.
There was an option, we should say, while we're on the topic, that you could have gotten cadaver tissue in there instead of your own, which is pretty fucking wild that was.
That is pretty wild.
I also
used
like
my
the idea
own.
they presented you that option. They were like, okay, look, we can give you your own flesh, or we can take a dead person's, which we'll just call cadaver flesh just to
really sink
bring
it in
the point
there.
home. And then,
Marketing department was off for this one. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Wild.
Yeah, we don't talk about our food like that. Do you want a cadaver sandwich?
Yep.
Sorry, I meant a burger.
Yep.
Anyways, so Monday night, I wasn't in the mood for much, and my face hurt, so I vaped a bunch of weed, and then I was sitting at my computer, and I was like, "What can I do that is kind of dumb?" And I was like, maybe I could just play around with Copilot, because I'm a game maker programmer, and I haven't really gotten much of a chance to use GitHub Copilot, which is this fancy AI tool that lives in VS Code, and it like helps you with your programming.
And VS Code is just a code editor.
Yeah. And I was like, well, I need a programming problem to play around. I can't just like start writing code for no reason. That would be crazy. So I started thinking around of like what kinds of problems I might have. And one of the things that kept coming up was this problem from my WoW guild that has been this insurmountable kind of combinatorial explosion management problem. So I'll try to summarize it very briefly.
And that's
Okay.
WoW is in World of Warcraft. Just
World of Warcraft, yeah.
I have no idea what to assume our listeners, are going to know. So I'm just going to keep on.
All right. So in this game, you go and you fight bosses, and it takes 20 people to kill one of these bosses. And the boss fight can last sometimes up to 12 minutes. Usually at least like 3 minutes or so.
Yeah, which doesn't sound long, right? Except that you're orchestrating 20 people in this really complex boss fight. So you actually usually have to do it like how many times before you beat it?
100.
Well, So for the last boss, it took us like 200 something attempts.
Yeah.
You know,
Crazy.
And so you'll get like 5 minutes in, and then somebody makes a mistake and dies, and then it's like, well, that's it. And
Everyone's
then
dead now.
everybody, and then we usually have a phrase like "off the edge," and we all leap off a cliff and die, so we can start. So one of the big challenges of these boss fights is that these bosses are doing all kinds of stuff to kill you. They're doing all kinds of damage. They're knocking people off of shit. They're like setting people on fire. There's all kinds of stuff, right? And it is scripted because it's a video game. So like what things are going to happen and when those things are going to happen roughly. And one of the big challenges of this is trying to make sure that you have enough ways to survive. Mm-hmm. And primarily that comes through your healing players who their whole role is keeping everybody alive. And those healers have all kinds of buttons to do lots of big healy stuff. Okay. But the problem with healing is that it's a zero-sum game. If I cast a heal on somebody who's already healthy, it won't do anything.
You just wasted all those healing points.
I wasted it. And if that button I pushed has a cooldown, so like if it's a really strong button that I can only hit maybe once every 2 minutes or something, then it was especially bad because, we overlapped. Like somebody else healed and then I hit my big healing button and then one of us wasted it. And then some later thing happens in the fight and we don't have any buttons left. Mm-hmm. Because we overlapped everything for no reason.
So you basically have a coordination problem with a resource that has a particular kind of a constraint limit on it, which is not just that it's only possible to produce so much from your team, but also that deploying it at the wrong time means that it didn't fucking matter.
It just, you might as well have not done it.
Which is
right.
rough. It's a very rough sort of situation.
Yeah. Now, damage dealers don't have this problem because the boss will have like 100 million health, right? And the more damage you do, the better. It's not like if Steve hits the boss really hard, you don't get to, right? Mm-hmm. Like damage dealers could just operate fairly independently, right? But healers are like trying to watch what each other are doing and try not to overlap shit. And it's this big coordination problem. So for some of the later bosses, the more difficult ones, they kind of ramp up as you get through a raid. The damage that comes in starts to become so tough to live through that you have to be very careful about like trying to manage these cooldowns and make sure that your healers are not overlapping or wasting things and stuff like that. And it was a lot of work for us to plan out these last couple of boss fights because we had to by hand go through and look at all the timings and try to figure out who's going to use what abilities and when. And that worked pretty well, and we covered like most things. But then every now and then, one of our healers would be like, "Oh yeah, I'm out today. I'm sick or something."
Right. This is sort of like for people who aren't familiar with the intensity of this, it's basically a hobby thing, right? Where it's like if you had a softball league, that people are pretty into, and everyone's playing every week, and then like so-and-so's got a business trip this week, so your pitcher's out. Yeah. You're like, okay, well, we'll sub in someone else. But if you had
it's like plan, adult sports, right? Yeah.
If you had some plan that was contingent on that person being there, then you kind of got to redo the plan.
You got to redo the plan.
And so you can have this problem where you have this cascade where it's like it takes a long time to plan a particular configuration of people. And then if any one of those people is not available, then it's not just that you can swap that person in completely. It's not actually quite as easy as like a pitcher. You just have another pitcher who like does the same job because you could have a different person who heals completely differently and has a different suite of abilities that they bring to the table.
Because there's 7 different kinds of healer in the game. And they all have different buttons that have different cooldowns that do different things. And so if we just have a 1-to-1 swap, then that's okay. Like if it's the same kind of character, but if we bring in a different kind of healer, then
it's just a different.
We can't do it, right? And so our solution up until now has been like somebody swaps in, and we basically just tell them like, well, everybody else has a plan, and you just do your best because we can't redo this plan because if we change something for you, then it cascades and forces every other thing to change, and we just don't have time, right? So I was thinking about this sort of combinatorial explosion problem of trying to manage all these cooldowns. And then I got to thinking about it even further, and I was like, it's not just healers. There's lots of people have these really useful buttons that do things to help other people in the group to survive and whatever. And we often don't coordinate those very well either, just because we're so overwhelmed just with trying to coordinate the abilities of 4 healers instead of like 20 people, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was like, I think this is a programming problem, right? Yep. Like if I could come up with a way to represent this information and basically make a thing that kind of like generates a plan for us where it tries to not overlap things and it tries to prioritize certain abilities that match what's happening in the boss fight, you know? And so I was like, great. So I sat down and I just started, and like, I don't know Python that well. And also like, just to bring us back to the story, my gums hurt and I was vaped up on weed real good. Okay. So,
which also for some context, weed became legal in Missouri. Recently. So,
and would recommend. It's a great way to relax. So I was sitting at the computer and I was like, well, I'm gonna start programming this thing and just like see what I can do with it. And so I booted up VS Code. I made a new file. It's called like raidcooldowns.py, which is Python, right? So like as soon as I start this thing, then now Copilot is like, yeah, I know Python. Let's fucking go, right? Mm-hmm. And so I didn't really know how to start, and so I just started like writing comments, kind of like describing what I wanted to do. Yeah. And then Copilot just started like doing Python to do the stuff that I described in my comments. And then I was able to then come in and start like looking at what came out and figure it out and then make changes to it. And, you know, and by the time like an hour and a half had passed, I had like 500 lines of code. And this thing was like actually doing a decent job of the thing that I wanted to achieve. Right. Mm-hmm. And I was like, man, if I can do this like with a programming language I barely know, while in pain and kind of stoned, like, this is a pretty sweet deal.
Yeah.
So I started jamming on this thing on like Monday night and then Wednesday night. And I started talking to my guildmates about it, and they were like, well, this is fucking crazy. Like if you could actually pull this off and like make this thing work well, we could use this, you know? And so then I started talking to Adam about it. I was like, hey, Adam, do you want to do a little programming jam this weekend? And he's like, yeah, but fuck Python. Mm-hmm. JavaScript is better. And I was like, shit, but that's okay because we have Copilot. Mm-hmm, we can just convert this entire thing over to JavaScript fairly easily. Mm-hmm. And so on Saturday we did that. And also like, I don't know JavaScript that well. So switched over to JavaScript with the help of Adam and Copilot. And got it so that it hooks into like the Airtable API. So like using Airtable as an interface to manage all the stuff and configure all that stuff. Like the Airtable API is just phenomenal.
It's real slick. Very
slick. You can just hook into it with like a few lines of code and just get what you need. So we've been working on this stuff and I was just like programming with Copilot all weekend, jamming on this little like fun little side project. And then Monday rolls around, boot up Game Maker. I'm like back to working on Crash Lands 2 stuff. I boot up Game Maker, and all weekend my programming had kind of switched gears to like thinking about things at a very high level and like writing some pseudocode or comments to do stuff and having Copilot just be like, and just spit out like 20 lines of code doing exactly what I wanted. And then when I got to Game Maker, I started typing, and then I found myself just like starting to type things and then just waiting. And then nothing would happen. And like, shit. And then I had to keep like going and looking up variable names or like trying to remember, you know, what I had written 20 lines earlier.
It was something I've been trying to articulate because recently I've been trying to help out on the Game Maker programming side. And so like every week for the past, it's been like, I don't know, for 4 or 6 weeks or something. But every week I've been working on stuff. I try to articulate like just how hard it is for me to like
go back to not having
all this stuff, but especially in a new context, you know, because like I don't know the code base very well. I don't know Game Maker language that well. And so and just that at one point I talked about that idea of like I'd found myself every time I bounce into Game Maker, I would just like type something, and because I'm basically waiting for super fancy autocomplete, right, where it's just spits out the rest of the line, and doing that kind of just like waiting thing, you know. And I had articulated that at the beginning, and everybody was like, oh, that's really, you know, kind of amusing and stuff. But I was like, nobody else has really just like experienced though, like what this is like. And so I was really glad that Seth now had the weekend of seeing what it can be like, you know.
Yeah.
And then coming
and like
back.
and you'd been talking about it, and the thing is I believed.
Oh yeah, but it's theoretical until it's experiential.
Until you yourself can feel like, wow, this. And the thing is, it's not that Game Maker sucks. It's just that Copilot is so fucking good, right? Yeah. And so once you've had it, and then once you lose it, it feels like you've lost like a part of your brain, you know. And so on Monday, I spent the morning like working on some stuff in Game Maker. And then by Monday afternoon, Adam and I were just like sitting in the Discord, we were chatting about stuff. And I was like, man, I feel like I'm coding in molasses now. You know, like I'm stuck. I could barely move. And Adam was like, do you think it's time to revive the Game Maker in VS Code project? Which is a theoretical project.
Yeah, and I've been kind of working on that on the side, but like just for fun, because I've been just waiting for permission to like make it a studio project, you know, because I want it every time I jump into Game Maker, but like I'm not the main Game Maker person, so it doesn't really matter if that's what I want, you know. But then as soon as Seth started to talk about this, I was like,
it's time.
It's time.
And this was something we had talked about when we first started doing a lot of our AI research way back when, which was like people with Copilot will just be making way more code, way faster, way more reliably than people without Copilot. Yeah. It's just a fact. You can't argue.
There's so much less stuff you have to like look like. So then yesterday I was working on a theming thing, and so I just have like 100. Like I have 100 icons, but all named in like a really predictable ways, right? And then I have this I just have this configuration file I have to fill out, right? And so I'm like, oh god. So I start filling it out, and then Copilot's like, I see what's going on here. Just Copilot's like, don't even spits out the whole damn thing. But then also I get to the point where, because I'm like, I need icons to map onto file types, right? So like, I get into a section where like, okay, I need like video file types, right? So I'm like, well, what's the one video type I can remember off like the top of my head, right? So I'm like, AVI, right? Colon, and then the name of the thing that I want to use. And then I'm like, oh, what are the other ones? But it doesn't matter because I just hit enter, and then VS Code's like FLV. Blah, blah, blah. It just
Copilot's like, I see what's going on
to
here.
the point where it's actually too many because it spat out like 20 different kinds of video files. And I was like, I don't even need this many, you know?
But
normally that's the kind of thing I would have to go like look up somewhere and be like,
it'd take you like an afternoon to compose that list.
Yeah,
it's just literally instant. Yeah. So back when we started our AI stuff, we did have the conversation about like, how can we get it so that we can do our game programming with the support of Copilot? And where we kind of landed was that, Game Maker still has so many features of like sprite editing and like all the audio stuff and, like room editor, blah, 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 that it's very difficult to think of it as like just a programming environment, right? Mm-hmm. And VS Code is very, very much a programming environment, right? And you can do a lot of plugins and stuff with it, but sort of at baseline, if we said, could we do like make an extension or something in VS Code that would allow us to get all of the programming support and like be able to do all the stuff in VS Code that we can do in Game Maker? And the answer at the time was probably not, because it'll just like, there's so many features that Game Maker has that it would just be too much, to get there. But after this past week and a half, I've kind of switched gears and basically landed on like, you know what? That's okay. Like if I can get Copilot, then it's okay if we can't do literally everything in VS Code, because I could always open up Game Maker to do those handful of things that we haven't like recreated in VS Code.
And the fact is you do spend most of your time programming in Game Maker. That's most of what you're doing. So
yeah, exactly. And so then Adam and Shure just started blazing forward on getting a VS Code extension so that we can work on Game Maker projects through VS Code. And because they have Copilot to help them make this extension, the features have been coming
so fast
that I don't really have words. Like literally like on Monday afternoon this week. So right now it's Friday when we're recording this. Like on Monday afternoon, at the end of the day, we had the conversation of like, hey, maybe we should like do this thing, right? And so then on Tuesday, I started using VS Code for Game Maker just to like get a sense of where we were at. And I was like, oh yeah, like syntax highlighting is kind of whack. Like it's not giving me the right color coding for things, And like that afternoon we had it. And then like every time I would come up with something, I'd be like, oh yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem. And it was never more than like an hour before that feature was in and
I did have a head start because I'd been working on this on like weekends and evenings, like here and there, leading up to now. But the reason, because I'd actually tried this like a year ago unsuccessfully because they were just so like, I think I was also just kind of taking the wrong approach. But I rebooted it, I don't know, like just like 6 weeks ago or something. Like it's still really recent. But the reason that I'd already made a bunch of progress, because I probably total put like maybe 12 hours into it on the side before this week. But all of those were Copilot and ChatGPT assisted, right? So I already had like a fully functioning and deployable extension. It just was doing the bare minimum, right? Like really basic highlighting, really basic support of various types. But the fact that I had gotten there already and already had a lot of parity actually with like baseline editing GameMaker stuff that even like
you'd already done the setup work. Basically.
Yeah, I already did the setup, but so much of that was from like there's like aspects of building a visual like an extension to provide a language, a new programming language to an editor, and I knew of them, but I didn't know how to do any of that. There are all these like configuration files, and I don't know how they work, and the documentation is all over the place, and a lot of it's outdated, but I would just go and it's like when I couldn't figure something out, I would just like go into ChatGPT and be like, hey, how does I don't understand how these files work. Like explain how these things relate to each other. And then it would do like a decent job actually most of the time. Like it was wrong here and there and all of that, right? But it did a good enough job that it easily cut out half of the time I would have spent just like experimenting and searching documentation, right?
Yeah, it's like 12 hours instead of 24
Yeah, exactly.
hours,
Like
right,
it just gave me such a huge boost. And then recently, GitHub released Copilot for Docs, which is basically ChatGPT, but on top of some certain kinds of documentation, including VS Code, right? So now there's actually an interface I can go because I'm in the early access phase of that. So then this week also, like if I'm trying to find out how to do something and it's just like I can't figure it out, it's like spread across documents and people's issues on the internet and all that kind of stuff. I just go in there and I just type a question in Copilot for Docs for VS Code, and it's been less accurate there actually than like other parts because I think it's just like so specific, but still accurate enough that it's like just gotten me over all of these humps that I easily like. So it's like in the span of this week, if I didn't have these tools available, this stuff would have required so much like trial and error and like reading documentation and all this kind of stuff that it would have taken at least twice as long to make this much progress.
Yeah. So it's been this like weird thing where, by the fact that like I got my gums stabbed by a scalpel led to this kind of like cascading AI Trojan horse that has now caused us to basically say like, we want VS Code in GameMaker, but we can't have it. Or sorry, we want Copilot in GameMaker, but we can't have it.
Yep.
But can we take GameMaker out of GameMaker and put it into VS Code where we do have Copilot? And because Copilot exists, doing something like that, like developing your own extension in VS Code to be able to like add a new programming language to it and like a new project, and it's turned out to be not that big of a deal.
Yeah. And VS Code is just, it's a really good editor with like so many, because it's something we've been talking about this week too, is that a code editor experience is mostly comes down to like a million tiny user experience details, right? And VS Code has this huge advantage, which is it's been around for a while now. It has this huge, it's the most popular editor on the market by a huge margin. And it has this like whole ecosystem of plugins and a way of like building extensions and plugins and stuff, right? So it already has solved like all of the little tiny, really hard details of like what happens when you move the cursor around, right? Like stuff that seems like if you've never actually thought through all the things that are going into even just like a text editor, like if you're in your word processor or something, the sheer amount like of questions that are being answered, like what happens when you hit the down key, right? And you're in a paragraph, right? Where does the cursor supposed to go, right? And if you hit up, if you hit up again, where is it? It should end up right back where it was, you would think, right? But like
I've had to solve these problems.
It's so many tiny problems
in our games, and yeah, it's like a week of work to make just like the most basic text editor because. And there's also stuff like you never think about the fact that when you're looking at text, there are just like thousands of characters being rendered on your screen.
Yeah.
How? Like, how do you? It makes sense. Like, if you look at a picture and it's like, yeah, it's a picture, right? It's one file, right? But like, how is this thing efficiently rendering thousands and thousands of independent characters, right? Without just like making the CPU or the GPU, catch on fire. There's all these little things that you don't think about, but then like somebody who's made it an editor like VS Code, like they've solved all of those problems, and you don't have to worry about that stuff. You can build on.
Yeah,
on
you
top
can
of it,
just add features, which is delightful. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been a pretty wild journey, and it kind of had a point where like yesterday was the first day where I just programmed in VS Code to work on our games for the whole day, and then I just did one thing at the very end that I had to open up Game Maker for, right? So it's like, and we're still using the Game Maker like runner and programming language and all that stuff, but we just basically like are using a different IDE now. So. That's been a wild trip, and I think it's just kind of like it does make me think about how I've talked to quite a few people about AI stuff who are totally out of the loop, and it always feels like when I'm describing to them like what these tools do, I just sound insane. Like we're talking to somebody about ChatGPT, and they're like, "Oh yeah, like do you need a contract? Like it can make that." Exactly based on the terms that you specify. Do you want some poems? Do you want a children's book? Do you want to do some programming? Like it seems so stupid that you could just kind of like, hey, do you have a problem? Like use this tool. It's so open-ended that people have a really hard time latching on to these things because it's not like a hammer, right? Well, like if somebody has a nail and they're like, how do I get this into this wood? Right. And you're like, well, there's this exact specific tool for that problem. Here you go. And it's an obvious like one-to-one match. But with so many of these AI tools, they can do so many things that it's very hard to convey to somebody when and why and how they should be using it. And then like what I experienced this past weekend, is that like once you do start using it, you can't unsee all of the things that you could be doing with it.
Yeah, which I think of that as like programming in general, actually. It's one of the things like I've always been a big proponent of trying to get everybody around me to learn programming for like that same reason, right? Which is because it wasn't until because I started self-teaching shit back in 2008 now, right? So a long time ago. But only because I was like, this sounds neat. Right? But I didn't have any like real world use cases because I didn't know what I could do with it. I just thought this sounded cool, So I started learning it, and then there was a point like a month in or something where I was in the lab doing lab work, and I was like learning this stuff on the side, and all of a sudden like some dots connected, and I was like, oh, like
this is a programming
problem, right? And then from that moment forward, suddenly I could see programming problems, right?
It's like the Matrix. You can see.
Yeah, you can see it now, and that's
code.
Yeah, that's one of those things. Like, there's a point you have to hit experientially of like using these things and like them applying them to the world, where now all of a sudden like everything connects, and you're like, oh shit, right? And it changes how you view the world and solving problems in it. But until that time, like everything is just this kind of like theoretical, interesting, kind of concept, but there's no obvious application for it.
Yeah. And this is something that I think a lot of people are going to be caught off guard here because young people are great at this because they have no pre-established ways of doing things or thinking, right? Like they'll just do stuff and like nothing is at stake and they just do things, which is why like I've been reading all these reports about like college students and high school students, and something like 85 to 95% of college and high school students report that they are using ChatGPT almost every day for some aspect of their schoolwork, whether it's literally like doing their schoolwork for them, essentially cheating, or just using it as like a tutor or to help them. But then if you go talk to adults, the number is
like it's inverted.
So much lower. Yeah, because like they've been doing stuff a certain way and they just will keep doing that, right?
Well, I think it's also like because the messaging around it is, I think it's all being done in the worst way possible, because all the messaging in avenues that adults are like paying attention to, right, is basically how AI is coming to take everyone's jobs.
It's taking our jobs, yeah.
And like, hey, look, you can use it to generate anything. So blah blah blah. When the reality is that these things are really good when you pair them with somebody who knows the material, right? That's where they actually are really good. And outside of that context, they're like they're fun toys. Right. And they can do some like surprising stuff. And sometimes they can do some impressive stuff. Right. I mean, it's actually, frankly, always impressive because the tech is really impressive. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like actual practical uses, like it's the pairing of human expertise and knowledge with these tools that really shines. And I think that's where just being willing to go engage with these things, right? And as you're saying, having no pre-existing notions of exactly how you're supposed to do stuff, but also not being at the part of like life where all you care about is like your economic situation, whether you're going to be out of money in 10 years, because like that's all, like, as adults out in the world, that we're just like so focused on capitalism not killing us that we're just like, you don't get to go into those levels unless you're in tech. And then in tech,
you cannot explore. You can only exploit. Yeah. So it's been kind of a transformative week. I'll probably have some more to say about it.
And then extension is available. So if you are a game maker developer, and
that's true.
Yeah, if you want to boot up VS Code, so it's Visual Studio Code. It's a Microsoft product, totally free, which is, I still don't understand why, because it is so good, but it's free. It's developed by Microsoft, and then there's just extensions you can get. So
you can get the Copilot extension.
You can get the Copilot extension,
which is called Stitch.
Yeah,
that's the Game Maker extension.
Yeah, so if you just go to the extensions thing, do a search for Stitch, then you can just install it and start using it right there. And the Stitch, like when you find it in there, then it has a whole page describing like what it can do and what your options are and how to configure it and stuff. So you can just start using it.
Yeah. And you do still need to have Game Maker. I have Game Maker installed.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. It kind of like hooks into it. So it's not a replacement of it or anything like that. So it's been a pretty fun week. All right, well, let's get on to some questions.
Let's go.
What do you guys think? All right, let's do it. Yeah. These questions come from our listeners over at podcast.bscotch.net. And the highest upvoted question comes from Teele, who says, Adam,
what?
Oh, I would like to hear your mouth noises on web tech and frameworks, presumably words, not just like slurping sound.
Yeah.
I heard you once say something like, fuck React in one of the past episodes. I'm curious what you like for front end and back end web dev. I've been enjoying Django lately, even though it's kind of cheating.
That's Django.
So
it's got a D in
so this is
it.
some, yes. So this is something that I always find hilarious whenever people talk about web stuff. And I also found this when like working with Adam over the past weekend on some of the JavaScript stuff we were doing, is web developers have this inbuilt knowledge of like 1,000 different microservices that have really fucking weird names.
Yeah.
And they'll be like, I need to add two numbers together. Don't worry. There's a plugin for that. And then it's like called Weed Whacker or something. Yeah,
there's
like
two web dev podcasts I listen to that both have variations of like a little game show internally where they feed people a set of like 4 things. And they're like, which one of these is a web framework, right?
Svelte.
You cannot guess. Yeah. Svelte Kit is my top one right now. But
you got Rust.
Rust is a programming language, but I bet you anything there's a JavaScript framework called Rust.
Like Ruby on Rails.
Ruby on Rails is another web framework for the Ruby language. But it's like because there's especially recently there's like Astro and like Remix and like the list just.
These are just
any word you can think of. There's a web framework, and they literally come out like every week, and so it's one of the things about web dev is it's as an environment, it's just like that's what it's like to be in it. So at any given moment, there's like the next hot thing that you're supposed to learn, right? And then like the next new approach to how do you think about these things, and so there's just new jargon being developed constantly, and then people are fighting about it, and everyone's like, oh, now this thing is dead now, and just like it just keeps on.
This thing is dead. It was just born 6 months ago. It's dead.
Yeah, but nobody cares now. It's
so where are you at now? So if React. Fuck React, obviously.
Well, so I mean, so all without getting too into the weeds, React is the framework out there, right? So like if you're working for a company and they're doing any web stuff, which is basically any company, right? It's probably in React. Especially if it's a newer company. If it's an older company, it might be some of the tech that isn't like all hyped, right? Which isn't to say it's worse, but it's not part of like the hype cycle, right? And so React has now been around for long enough. It's a Facebook product, which is part of why I don't associate with it. But it's really robust. It's like developed with high engineering standards, right? I don't like its opinions because its opinions are like, we shouldn't be opinionated. So you still have to like figure out how to do literally everything. We just provide some of the core parts, which like, no thanks. Just give me shortcuts. I don't.
That's a cop out.
I don't need to make decisions about all this stuff. Like I can be comfortable with decisions I don't like as long as I don't have to make them myself, right? So Which I think
That's a good life philosophy.
that's a state that I've like developed over time. Because I used to just be like, I don't like this. I'll just go make my own. Right. And now I'm just like, we were joking about this too. Because when Seth was in JavaScript for the first time, and I had installed an auto formatter because like I hate even thinking about like, did I tab this or whatever? I just code and then save. And then when I save, it just my code just gets auto formatted to like have the right number of annotations. Right. It has no settings. I can't even choose how it formats.
Perfect.
Not even any options, right? And so Seth's looking at some of these things and he's like, oh, I hate that it did this. I'm like, yeah, you get used to it though, you know, because like I don't like it either.
Though?
You know?
Really?
You do actually, right? You just
well, it's more that like
used to it.
It's more that like, yeah, I mean, you don't really get to hate it though.
Yeah, you don't have to.
It's just a fixed. You can have opinions about it, but it'll be a waste of your time.
Hey, it's like the weather.
Yeah, so you just don't. Yeah, exactly. It's like the weather. So that's
you
kind of
pissed off that it's raining. It's just raining.
Yeah.
You know, that's just what
so
it is.
all of my opinions are sort of like the root of them come down to like I don't want to have I want to be able to create interesting, useful things with minimal kinds of decisions, right? I just want to give a set of like, okay, here's a way you can make all of this stuff happen. And as long as it can make the stuff happen I want to have happen, then we're golden, right? And the other like hard requirement I have now for any tech that I use, is as long as it's possible, is minimal cognitive load by really good tooling. So that's why I'm a huge TypeScript fan, which is basically a version of JavaScript that adds all kinds of fancy tooling that makes it just so much easier to know what's going on because the tools tell you. They're just like, oh, this is broken now because you changed this thing over here, and it can tell.
Perfect.
Right? So now all of a sudden, like the cognitive load goes down. So I like tools that, and especially because I have to bounce around to different kinds of tech. So people who just like live in React all day, like it's a very cool, very robust, enormous, complex piece of machinery, right? And if you're a deep expert in it, you can do anything, and it's very cool. But it's not a thing that you can just be like, oh, I mean, you can, but like the power you have is now much more limited if you're like in our situation where sometimes I'm doing game maker programs, sometimes I'm building VS Code extensions, sometimes I'm building CLI tools, right?
Yeah, if you got to bounce around a lot more, then it's not quite as
yeah, it's good for like an enterprise with 100 people all building the same website. It's like that's a perfect piece of tech for that. For my case, which is now more focused on just individual autonomy, being able to jump in and out of stuff, right? I just need stuff that makes decisions for me and is really easy to jump into. And I don't worry as much about like, what's the long-term likelihood that this thing is still around in 10 years? Like, who gives a shit? I'll just use something else then, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, JavaScript will be.
JavaScript will be. It can't go away because it's baked into the internet, right? So that's why I'm a big fan of SvelteKit, which is one of the latest of the things, but it just hit its 1.0 release last year, I think, or 6 months ago. It's very recent. Actually, I think it was just like 6 months ago. And it's just like the nicest, friendliest way. Like it has a whole bunch of really strong opinions, but there's only a few that I just don't like for the most part. And those ones that I didn't like, I looked up because like it's all an open source project and the main developer of it is just on like GitHub issues. And people are like, I hate this. And he's like, well, here's why we did it this way. And every time I've read one of those, I'm like, okay, yeah. Like I still don't like it, but now I see why you did that. And so fine, right? And so he had to do all the work, like he and his team, of like making a million decisions, right? That had to work in a huge array of contexts because they wanted to have a highly opinionated thing where you didn't have to make decisions, right? And
so it makes it nice to work with.
It's just so nice to work with because you learn what the opinions are. And then you just get to go build stuff. You know,
just work with them.
You just work with them. You're not making a million decisions. So, and a lot of the newer tools like have kind of shifted to that, and frameworks have kind of shifted to that model. So there's a lot of cool stuff doing it. But long story short, like that's the kind of way that I evaluate these things. And so I don't actually think fuck React. I think fuck React for my own use cases. Like I won't touch it if I can avoid it, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's too hard to use to jump in and out of. And you have to be too much of an expert in it to use it, rather than if you just know a lot about HTML and JavaScript and just like web stuff, you could just jump right into Svelte. You have to know almost nothing, like because it all like is really intuitive and just kind of makes sense. And so that's the kind of stuff that I look for these days.
Yeah, and worst case scenario, like just ask ChatGPT, you know?
Yeah, well, actually, that's kind of a problem because Svelte is only recently popular.
That's true. Yeah.
So ChatGPT and Copilot don't know very much about Svelte, but because Svelte, though, is like, it feels like you're just writing HTML and JavaScript. It doesn't feel like you're in a fancy, complicated, thing.
So Copilot can guess.
So
pretty
yeah,
well.
Copilot could actually like still do a really good job in that context. But if you're like, hey, tell me how to build a SvelteKit app, like from from the very beginning or whatever, you're gonna get pretty medium results because in 2021, like SvelteKit was a baby. It just barely existed, and that's when ChatGPT/Copilot
stopped learning.
It doesn't know anything after that.
Yeah, but although there are browsing plugins coming for ChatGPT, at which point you'll be able to ask it questions, then it can go get stuff off the internet and answer questions.
Yeah, actually, I do. Yeah, I got access to that also.
Oh man!
Or I got access to like the plugins thing, right?
We have a running joke in the studio now that Adam somehow has beta access to like every new piece of cutting edge technology that exists.
Yeah,
I assume you were there for like the SpaceX Starship launch and like all that.
I was in like the second wave of Copilot back when it was free, when they were first just like putting it out to experiment with it, and like every GitHub thing that gets released into betas and early access and stuff, like I sign up on the wait list instantly, the moment it appears, which is why, because like GitHub for Docs or Copilot for Docs, what I mentioned earlier, they're like not even adding new people into it. So like they have a Discord that they've set up where it's like just people being like, how do I get into this? Like, I want to get into this thing now. And they're like, oh, well, we have enough, initial users to get our first rounds of feedback and stuff. And so I just like got to sneak in under the radar for all these things. So,
oh man,
it's pretty fun.
It's pretty wild. All right. Next question comes from Bupanoilie Rolleepa, who says, what's the biggest misconception people have about working in the games industry?
I'll go for the low-hanging fruit first, which is just that making games and playing games are the same thing.
Yes, I was going to say, it depends on, I feel like it's almost a generational thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
So if you're talking about like people in the generations older than us, then yeah, that's always the response is something like, oh, so you just play games all day. Literally, like every single time I tell
Honestly, I heard that a lot when we first started, and I haven't heard it nearly as much recently. But I have gotten that exact comment where I say, I'm a game developer, and somebody says, oh, so you just sit around and play games all day. And it was so weird to me because I thought, what logical steps do you take that to believe that a thing is created in the exact same way it is consumed?
Oh, yeah. Very weird, right? Yeah.
In what world would that ever apply to anything that exists?
Yeah, so I think that's a big one. And I think among then first-time devs or people trying to get into it is actually similar, which is that most of game dev is making the game, when in fact maybe half of game dev is making the game. The other half is just all the other stuff, like we're talking about making this VS Code extension to manage the programming and like doing all the thought work required to figure out a control schema that spans across 3 different fucking platforms or whatever. It's like there's so many things that, again, kind of like the text editor thing we were talking about earlier. There's all these just thousands of decisions to make. Yeah, that you'll feel like sometimes you've just taken some crazy pills for a particular week because it's like, I feel like I've done nothing at all except for make a billion tiny decisions about stuff that essentially enable other things to happen, but don't themselves do a damn thing, So there's a lot of that. Like a lot more of that thing.
Yeah, even that first half you mentioned, which was like making the game, like making the game is itself 90% just like making decisions about a million things about the game and then actually like doing it, right? But it's actually figuring out what to do. And to your point about like, you'll spend a week and be like, what the fuck was this? It'll be a thing where like you go to do something that should be easy, like conceptually, because as a person, you're like, I mean, we talk about the door problem, right? But a lot, but it's such a good example, right? But you also you could take fishing, you could take anything as a mechanic that you want in a game. And there's like some aspect of it where you're like, oh, I want this to be a thing. And then it takes you a week to figure out how though, and how does this interact with all the other parts and blah, blah, blah. And like by the end of that week, you're like, ooh, finally I now got to add the doors that are twice as big as they used to be. Right. And that's the outcome, Right. And yeah, it could be it's weird.
Yeah. It actually reminds me a lot of so like when, this is kind of a weird segue, but like when the Ukraine war started reading a lot about what was going on there. and there was a lot of conversation about logistics because there were all these countries coming in and providing, weapons, aid, food, whatever to the Ukrainians. And then the Russian soldiers were coming in with like no fucking supplies at all. Like even saw some videos where like they had some new quote recruits in Russia. They were conscripted, right? And they were just told, we don't have any first aid supplies. So if you get shot or whatever, then here's some things you can do. Rip up your shirt and like tie it around your leg or, whatever. And it was just like that aspect of warfare, which is just like getting stuff where it needs to be
That's actually most of
it's
what
like
it is.
99% of it, and then like there's this tiny little bit of which is the people actually like using the stuff at the point in time where it was intended to be used. But all these like the U.S. military with all of its bases everywhere, it's just a logistics machine, right? And you've got and if you talk to any like people who have been in the military, they'll tell you that most of what they do is wait, right? Like it's not like they're just like sun up, sun down, just blasting the whole time. It's like lots of decisions, lots of planning, lots of movement of supplies, figuring out information, moving information. It's just logistics,
Loading and unloading things, driving things.
Yeah. And we like when we're working on our games, logistics is the same proportion
honestly,
of what we're doing.
It's actually very good. Like metaphorically, that's a really good jump because they talk about how your wars and stuff are won along supply line and logistical dimensions. Typically, because the reality is like it just doesn't matter if you have 100,000 like extra troops, but they're being slowly killed by winter. It's like
or
you can't or they ran out of ammo.
Or they ran out of fuel. Like this kept happening. Like the Russian tank convoys would just run out of fuel and then they'd just be chilling. Right?
Yeah. Like it does matter if you're actually in like a direct, moment of conflict. The numbers are typically, this is one of those truths, which is like just decide with more numbers typically is gonna,
yeah, but you still have to get the numbers there. And they have to have supplies and be healthy and know things.
So a tremendous amount of game dev, and it's true on the art side too. People think that that the art would be behaving any differently, but it's generally very wrong. Which is like there's all that technical setup. Like the thing I typically do at the end of my days now, before the next day, is basically get my files get my stuff sort of readied so that the next morning, when I'm coming in to knock out a bunch of new assets, that I can just go, right? And then, but so much of my just going is because we've established all these ways in which I go, such that the art could be flung out and be correct, on the other side. And so it's like there's so much of this setting up for a moment in time, executing on the moment in time within a very specific set of parameters that you have had to think through, and then essentially transferring the result of that execution to some other place, right? Each one of those pieces, basically the two around the execution are things that people know, just you don't think of them, you don't get into game dev because you like fucking building art pipelines. Like that's not usually a thing, right? But they're
you'll get to experience that until you're making the game.
Yes.
Like, oh shit, we need a pipeline. You know?
Exactly. It's not being on the shooting range. It's not Call of Duty. You know what I mean? Where it's like, it's just the part where you're shooting. It's just not how any of this works. And so it's shocking how much of it is not doing direct like execution of work.
Yeah. Well, and you can see how these things fall apart. So we've all heard the stories of Cyberpunk or No Man's Sky or whatever, where it's like the core concept of the game is great, right? And it's like, oh yeah, like this wild like open world like futuristic cyberpunk city with all these stories and stuff. But there's all these integration challenges of like, in our experience, like we've been working on some fishing stuff in Crashlands 2, and there's a huge leap from going like, okay, well, we have a fishing pole and you can cast it in the water, right? It's like, okay, well, we've got that, but now like you still need fish, right? So you need to be able to pull something out, and then you've got to figure out what those are for, right? Because the player's not just going to go do this for no reason. You've got to hook it in, and then there's questions about teaching. Like once you do have stuff in there,
how do you introduce?
When and how do you introduce the player to this stuff, and how do you do? And what else are they what else is contending for the player's attention at that time. And you have to know and figure out so much about the context of all these different points in time in the game so you can slot things in and weave them together, that if you don't have good mechanisms or tools for visualizing that or making decisions about it, in other words, like all the logistics, right, then everything just kind of grinds to a halt, you know? And so like so much of our time is spent on tooling, because even with as small of a team as we have, it's just logistics problem after logistics problem over and over and over and over again. And honestly, like, sometimes I kind of like envy, like I've talked in the past about that guy I met at GDC once who like worked on Final Fantasy games, and his only job was like from a different time in like graphics rendering, but his job was like making 2D shadows for 3D animations. So instead of actually having lighting, they just pre-rendered shadows, and then they just associated those shadows with like different parts of animations. And so this guy's job for this whole game was just to be given these 3D models with their animations and make shadows for them, right? And sometimes I think like, you know, it's boring probably, but also like,
pure execution, you know?
It's just pure execution. Somebody else is worrying about all the other bullshit, right? Like how the 3D models how the shadows will get hooked up and how the 3D models will work in the game and storytelling. You know, this dude is just off in the back, just chilling, just making his shadows for like 2 years. So,
yeah,
you know,
the cost of making decisions, I mean, basically bring us back to the last question, right? Which is like,
or to the co-pilot stuff.
Yeah,
right?
anywhere
like
you can
decisions are
offload
expensive.
decisions, like that's where you get to actually move ahead and do what everybody thinks it means. Like when people think it means, when you're playing video games or making video games, you're like jumping in and playing something and coming back out and then like making it really good and then jumping back in and like testing it or whatever. Right? And that's the reality that we want, you know, and
we're constantly striving to get closer and closer to that.
Yeah, but it means like the amount of like infrastructure and decision making we have to do to get there is just so high. And you get like a lot of all the stuff we talked about over the years of process improvements and tooling improvements and all that kind of stuff is really at root about how do we shift the logistics and decision making off of our brains onto systems so that they just happen now.
Yeah, it's a lot. So yeah, that's I'd say that's fair, Sam. That is a big misconception is that you're spending a lot of your time making games as opposed to talking about and making decisions about making games and the tools that you use to make them. All right, well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Goodbye. Bye.